Good morning, everyone. We will get started here in just a few seconds. Good morning, Miss Laurie. Good morning. Are we ready to do some learning this morning? Good morning. Good morning, Miss Donna. Good morning, Miss Angel. Everybody have a nice evening. We are going to learn about the proper way to put on a quilt border today. As with anything, you can do what I educate you on or choose to not. It's okay. But if you're having issues with quilts laying flat, or your long arm are having to take tucks or work a little harder on your quilt, I'm going to tell you or show you one way to help make that not happen. Good morning. All right. So we're just going to jump right in this morning and get started. I'm sure everybody has a busy day. I'll be back in the classroom teaching embroidery all day today. So I, again, am going to continue on talking about things to help make you a better quilter, or things that you may not realize that there is a right and not so right way to do this. We have been working through, we talked about 1/4 inch, we talked about squaring up blocks, but now we've got our quilt together. It's now time to put on borders. This is one last way to help make sure that the center of your quilt remains square for when you go to put your border on, and to make sure that it's square when it's all finished. Okay. So you may not notice this look so much when it's draped across your sewing table or you're holding it up for someone to see. So for you, this may be just fine. Again, you won't notice it so much unless you're trying to lay it out flat and along your thing. But let me tell you, your long armer is going to be quick to find it. When we start on the long arm, attaching the quilt and quilting down where we have, stitched things down so it can't move, we are quick to find where the wonky border is. So you're looking at, in this image, 3 quilts. I deal with a lot more than just these 3, but these are just 3 examples that I could find, showing you as you get down to the bottom of the quilt what happens when things are not square. When you quilt it, for the most part, you have a little bit more flexibility. You may not notice it so much on your own machine quilting, but you really see it when you get it attached to a long arm and start forcing it to stay the way that it is, and not allowing a lot of movement like you can in your own machine quilting. So what causes that? Wavy borders happen when basically your quilt top is either longer or wider around the outside edges than it is in the middle. And so when you think of the quilt as a square rectangle, you actually have to kind of give it more of an hourglass shape. It gets kind of maybe thinner in the middle than it is at top and bottom, and sometimes a quilt could be a pear where it's bigger at the top and smaller at the bottom. and things along that lines. It's when we're trying to take something and make it all the same size that it starts happening. Okay. So let's look at this quilt top again. Remember, we've got this wave that's happening. If I took measurements of this quilt, the bottom of the quilt measures 73.5 inches. The top of the quilt measures 73. The center only measures 72. That's 1.5 inches thinner in the middle than it is on the bottom. And then your top is 1 inch bigger than it is in the middle. So when you start quilting, so it's 73.5 at the top, and then as we quilt down, it's starting to get skinnier, and then it gets bigger when we get down to the bottom of the quilt. You're going to see that. Your quilt's going to go like this, or we're trying, as quilters or long armers, we're trying to make sure that seam line of your border stays straight. Well, if I've got a 72-inch border here, and that border ends up out here at 1.5 inches difference, that's 1.5 inches of fabric that we've got to find a place for it to go when you go to quilt it. Okay, so that's where you, if you've ever had a quilt long-armed or something along that lines, they've ever told you we need to take a tuck, we've got to do something. A lot of us long armers will work really hard to fix this. Unsew, put your borders back on right, you know, that type of thing. Re-square up the quilt, but it's kind of hard to do that when we don't find it until we get 90% of the way through quilting the quilt. So let's talk about how you keep this from happening, okay? Are you a slap and sew border person, or do you measure and cut? Okay. So, slap and sew, measure and cut. There's no, bad to either of them, but one is better than the other. And it is very easy to fall into the category of a slap and sew. I'm over this quilt, I want it to be done, I don't want to spend any more time working on it. Or you get down, you're like, I can see the finish line, let's just put this border on, and we slap it on and sew it. Okay? Not even taking any measurements of the center of our quilt and just putting the border on and sewing it down. So wonky borders usually happen with the slap and sew. So you take your border piece, you put it right sides together with the quilt, you sew it, you press it, and then you trim it off even with the end of your quilt. You don't measure it, you don't cut it to size, and you really probably don't even pin it in place. And there's nothing wrong with that. You just have to be, sometimes you can get lucky and everything is good, but you just have to be okay with having a wavy quilt, especially if you're going to hang it on the wall. It could be very apparent. I'm going to talk about how to do this right or correctly, and that is the measure and cut method. Okay? So, first thing that we have to do is determine the length. You could do the width first and then the length. When I put on a border, I typically am going to start with the longest direction of the quilt, which would be the length of the quilt. We're going to measure across the center of the quilt, and the center is the most important because that is typically going to be the smallest or shortest area of the quilt. And then I like to measure 2 additional places, kind of halfway between the center and the outside edge, but you want to make sure you're at least 6 inches in from the edge. You don't want to measure right on the edge of the quilt. Take that measurement and then find the average. So you add all 3 up and divide by 3. You're probably going to get some number that's unmeasurable on your tape measure, but I kind of look at that center number. I focus on that measurement. Okay? And I'm going to walk through a demonstration of it, but Once we find that number, we will cut 2 pieces of our border to that length. We're going to fold it in half and then half again. We fold the quilt in half and half again. And then we match those marks. You make your marks match. Okay? Don't just ignore them. We folded and found those creases for a reason. We need to make them match. This is going to help us figure out exactly where we need to ease fabric in or maybe do a little stretching with the fullness that we have. We sew it, you press it, and then we repeat for the other side. So let's take a look. All right, let's not take a look right this second. Let me turn that camera off and turn it back on. Let's get it to be the right color. Once you get your side borders on, you're going to repeat the process with the width of the quilt, except this time you're going to measure across the center of the quilt, and you're going to include the 2 new borders that you just added. Okay? So we have to make sure that we include that. Again, all those measurements, add them up, divide by 3, and then we can figure out our number. Okay? 1 second. I know it sounds like a lot of work, and it is a little bit more work, but your end result, you're going to be way happier with what comes out of your quilt. Okay, when you get to that point. All right, give me 1 second. Nothing like good old technical issues to start your day. All right. Yay, it's back to its regular color. We have here this morning, give me 1 second. Make that go away. All right. I have a quilt, a small quilt laying right here. So we have measure, I'm going to measure across the top. I'm going to come down, I'm going to measure through the center, and then I'm going to come down and I'm going to measure across the bottom at least 6 inches in. Okay? So first thing up, you want to make sure you have a tape measure that is long enough, and you want to have a surface that's flat enough. You don't want to be measuring on a with half the quilt hanging off the table. You want it to be nice and flat. I'm going to take my tape measure. I'm going to measure across, and excuse me, we are at 26 3/8 at this end. Through the middle, I am 26 1/2. Okay, so that's 1/8 of an inch difference already between top and bottom. And down here at the bottom of the quilt, I am 26 3/8. And I can almost, when I look at this quilt, I don't know if you can see it here, but you can kind of see that it curves down and comes back up just ever so slightly. Okay, this area wants to puff up. So I had 26 3/8 in 2 places and 26 1/2. And so right now my middle of my quilt is actually bigger than the ends of my quilt. So I need to pull these out so that they line up with the middle. So I'm going to cut 2 border pieces that are 26 1/2 inches in length, okay, so that we can stretch this that 1/8 of an inch to get it to come out even with the center. So I took my quilt, I have folded it in half, okay, I folded it in half, I found center, I did a little pressing there, and I actually marked it so that you could see it. And then I take the edge into the center and I crease it. I don't like to take my quilt and fold it in half and then fold it in half again, because this can be bulky and that's not really going to be super accurate. So I like to fold it in half, open it up, and then fold into the middle. So edge into that center crease, and then this edge into that center crease. Okay. We're going to take our border that is also cut to 26.5. I'm going to fold it in half. I'm going to fold end into the middle, and I'm going to fold the other end into the middle. Okay. And then we're going to start matching creases. So I'm going to put that crease, and I'm going to match it up to this mark in the center. This is my 1/4 point crease. Mark it here. And I'm going to make it match to that point. And then I'm going to match the ends. Okay? So I'm going to make my ends match. And then I'm going to repeat the process on the other side. That is all the pins I put in a border. Okay? If you need more, you can put more, but if you've got any sort of fullness in the area, you just kind of want to split the differences and start easing things in. That's there. So you can see down here, I have a little bit of extra, so I am going to make this border match. So you'll see that we have everything's kind of pinned in. I have a little bit of fullness right here in this area that for the most part your feed dogs on the sewing machine are going to take care of. And we're going to sew this. Now, anytime you have excess, okay, if you've got a bubble, as I refer to it, bubbles go towards your feed dogs on the machine. So I would put this underneath my machine and I would sew with the border on top. And the reason for that is your feed dogs will feed slightly faster and help to ease that fullness in. Like you can just see, I'm just the slightest little bit of tension makes that go away. And that would ease it in. Starting at the end, sew your 1/4 inch, and then I would press and flip this. And then I would repeat the same process down here at the bottom with the same 26.5 inch border. Okay. And then once those two borders were on, I would flip the quilt and we would remeasure from this border all the way out to this border and get the 3 new measurements. Again, focusing really on this border measurement through the center. Okay. That's there. What your goal is to get all 3 of these measurements to the same size or the same length. So as you do that, and you would do this for every round of borders, you would keep repeating. And if you do this, as you put borders on, your first border may be the biggest fussying that you have to do. And then as you put on the next border, you're going to see things starting to come back into the same measurements and things continuing to be square. The other way to be able to tell if your quilt is square, and it's harder to do with a big quilt, but if you lay this on, let's say, the edge of the table, put your quilt so that it hangs off the edge of the table. You may need some cans or something to hold on to this. Then pick up the bottom of your quilt and line it up to the top once you have the borders on. If you get a straight line across the bottom here where things line up at, straight line provided that I can hold this straight. But you will be able to tell if your quilt's not square because 1, it may not hang straight. 2, it may do that concave little hourglass figure that it has going on in that aspect. So you can quickly figure out what is going to happen. All right. I found a few really great resources in my research on this topic that is very interesting. She's actually got what do we call it? Like an experiment that it shows you the difference between if you took a quilt and did a slap and sew border and you took the same quilt and did the measure and cut border to it, that it comes out almost 3/4 of an inch bigger in certain areas of it, and it's interesting. Now, when you are doing your border, like I said, it can be challenging with a big quilt and in small spaces and things along that lines, but the overall result is going to be much better. I promise. It's going to take you a few extra minutes, but not that much. I have a question about, Miss Dana, is it this one that you're talking about? This one? This is the Lollipop quilt fabric from Amanda Murphy. I have it in 3 colorways. If it's this one you're talking about, this is the table topper of the month for next month. But yes, this is the Lollipop fabric. We have it, it's in panels in 3 colorways. That's there. Okay. Do I have questions about that? Because I know that was quick. I think this is maybe the quickest breakfast club ever. But I will get the, I've not had any caffeine this morning. I'm sorry. Words will come to me. I will get the presentation up on our Facebook page, on our website, so that you can pull that down and use it as a reference. I suggest if you are a slap and sewer, that's okay. No judgment. Sometimes, maybe, I just do that. But usually it's on small things. You will give it a try. See if you can tell a difference between it on a smaller project in that aspect. But let's go back to these quilts. Okay. So if you remember, these were all the bottom borders of the quilts. Now, you should never underestimate the value of your long armor's magic. And if you are somebody that maybe doesn't measure and cut, doesn't square up and things along that lines, that you may want to give your long armor a hug, because we can work some magic, because never fear, the quilts aren't ruined. Here's what they ended up looking like. So, trust that we can do we can fix things. This one right here, this quilt, let me go back. So this middle quilt right here, and I will tell you that a majority of the issue with this quilt right here is this miter. There's too much excess fabric. Mitering quilts has a tendency to, mitered borders, you have to be very, very careful with. Okay, so there is a small tuck that had to be taken in this because there was no way to make it go away. So if we have to take a tuck in the quilt, we typically try to do it as straight as we can, and then you can come back with your hand sewing and whip stitch and stitch that down. Okay, we try to make it as least obvious as possible if we can't make it disappear like we did in the other quilts. All right, so yes, give your long armor a hug. We work hard to make things that aren't square for you. All right, well, thank you everybody. Like I said, quick instruction on how to put on a border. In March, we are going to, the second weekend in March will be a foot breakfast club that we're going to talk about the Bernina presser feet attachments 87 and 88. Those are the bias binding attachments. And at the end of March, we're going to talk about binding. And so I will I will re-educate everyone on the invisible finish and on how I miter my corners and seam allowances for binding. So we will see that at the end of March, and then you will be able to, I think Miss Dawn should just come and teach binding, because she does a machine front and machine sewn down binding probably better than I do. She's had a little bit more practice. I'm a hand binder, so putting binding down by machine is not my forte. I can tell you how to do it. It just takes practice. All right, but we'll talk about that at the end of March, and then you should be perfect quilters by the end of March. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. I will get this presentation up on our website. And I think I can post it in the Facebook Society group as well. And, oh yeah, see, Dawn, you can crash Friday Night Live. Why don't you come crash Saturday Morning Breakfast Club, too? Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend, and we will hopefully see you soon.